Hello everyone. Let's start talking about Marxism. That's actually really interesting political ideology, which is quite relevant for this module. So our program today, a very brief recap, and then learn more about Marxism, and we will actually look into the Communist Manifesto and into the Capital written by Marx, the two major works written by Marx. And we will look at some quotes and reflect a little bit on the quotes in the end of this lecture. So remember, on Monday we talked about totalitarian ideologies, and we said behind totalitarian ideologies more in general is usually a utopian vision of an ideal society. Totalitarian ideologies usually also build on a pessimistic view of human nature, so they see human beings as selfish, antisocial, incapable of making their own decisions. And we know from conservatism already that usually if there is a pessimistic view of human nature, that requires the vision of a very strong government. We also said what's quite dangerous in totalitarian ideologies is the distinction between real and felt needs. So the ruling party or the government could actually claim to enact the real needs of the people, which can be against their will, can be coercively, and can actually be to realize their own private interests. So there is this distinction has to be made, and that can lead to quite some dangerous action. Then there's sacrifice of freedom. So totalitarian states reduce the degree of personal political freedom, quite in contrast to liberalism, actually, if you remember. And they often offer material economic security, and this is the same in communist thinking and fascist thinking. Then there is a strong politicization. So in totalitarian ideologies, everything is being politicized. And we talked about the example of the Hitler Youth in former Hitler Germany, where actually there's a youth organization already which is making the entire life political, and which is asking young people to maybe report on their neighbors, on their friends. So everything is becoming politicized. And we actually had the same in communist states as well, or in socialist states, more communist states. There were also youth organizations, and there was also this dominance of the political sphere over the private life. So this is quite similar in different totalitarian ideologies. And there's something that we call state supremacy. So the individual is always perceived as a subordinate part of the greater whole of the state, and everything you do is, claim to contribute to the state, to a powerful state. And one thing I wanted to add after the lecture on Monday is that we have different totalitarian ideologies. So what you can see here on this slide is basically some general characteristics of totalitarian ideologies, but the actual ideas that we are talking about are different in, let's say, communism and fascism, of course, right? So communism very left-oriented, fascism very right-oriented, but still totalitarian ideologies have some common characteristics, and these are those, this utopian vision, and the distinction between real and felt needs, sacrifice of freedom, strong politicization, and state supremacy. And then we talked about fascism in more detail. We said we have totalitarian methods of government here, and fascism has to be understood within the context of time, and it evolved, for example, in Nazi Germany as a reaction to the Weimar Republic, as a reaction to liberalism, and often also as a reaction and a criticism of communism. There was actually little logical scrutiny in in fascist thinking, but the main components, we said, was the racialist basis, to really think that there is a nation which is superior to other nations, that there's a culture and a race, the Aryan race, which is superior to other races. So a natural inequality. Then ultra-nationalism, meaning not only that you emphasize your own nation, but also that you think you need to expand your own nation. And state authoritarianism, so an authoritarian state that everyone had to, that basically dominated people's life, and a very weak society that could be in opposition. So very strong state here. Okay, so this is just summarized fascist thinking, and now we're moving from the far right to the far left today, to Marxist thinking, which is actually really, really interesting, I think. So this is Karl Marx. He lived from 1818 till 1883, and he was actually a German philosopher, economist, sociologist, and journalist. He later on became stateless, so he moved from Germany and then to London, where he spent much of his life, and where he also wrote some of his most important works. And he actually decided to become stateless and not to belong to one particular state or Germany anymore. And his most important works that we will also look at some quotations of his most important works in the end of this lecture, is the Manifesto of the Communist Party, Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei, and the Capital, Das Kapital. And you can see the Manifesto of the Communist Party here, a little picture of that. So this is Karl Marx. Let's look at his thinking, at his political ideology. So I think it's really relevant actually to understand and study Marxism and socialist ideas today, because they present such an important alternative to the very dominant liberal thinking and the understanding of individual liberty and consumerism, which also comes along with inequalities of wealth. So it's a really important alternative to our main dominant thinking today. The criticisms of capitalism made by Marx may indeed provide us with a tools for critical analysis to actually understand the shortcoming or failures of our Western societies. And another important reason why to study Marx, I think, is that by understanding Marx, we can also understand the driving forces and momentous events of the 20th century. So just think about, the Eastern and the Western Bloc, the Cold War, the arms race, and the Korean and Vietnam Wars. If we actually understand Marxism, it helps us to understand these events in the 20th century. So Marx mainly points, and this is one of his central arguments, quite important, to the centrality of the economic sphere. So he claims that the way in which we organize the economy affects the entire social structure, including the distribution of power and the type of policies adopted within the political sphere. So the economic sphere influences everything else, the political and the social. The idea that economic relations determine political relations actually challenges both liberalism and conservatism. While liberals see individuals as capable of making and shaping their own lives, Marx maintains that our perspective on life and our opportunities are very much shaped by our position in the economic sphere. So liberals would always argue we are individuals, we're capable of shaping our lives, and Marx would say, no, this depends on our position in the economic sphere. And then conservatives maintain that we should treat our political institutions with reverence and respect, but Marx would regard such arguments as little more than attempts by the privileged elite to protect and defend their position And this is also one of the critical points that we raised in relation to conservatism. So let's look at Marx's view of human nature. In Marx's understanding, ideas of human beings, or how human beings essentially are, so the human nature, cannot be seen independent of the social context. So we always have to look at the social context to understand how human beings essentially are. Human thoughts and activities are always determined by the social context. So the communist form of economic and political organization produces cooperative human beings, whereas a capitalist system reproduces competitive, utility maximizing, and capitalist human beings. So if we organize our economy in the communist forms, we are more cooperative, but if we live in capitalism, we're more competitive. While animals produce purely instinctively to meet physical needs, humans are capable of consciously shaping the world as an expression of their own creativity. And it is this capacity, which distinguishes human beings from animals. So economic activity is central to human beings. Just think about yourselves. Think about how proud you are if you build something, right? Let's say you repair your bike, or you make some curtains, or you paint something, or you produce something else. This is inherent in Marx's thinking. He says, because economic activity, producing something, is so central to our understanding of ourselves as human beings, the way we organize economic activities basically determines all other spheres of social life, including the political sphere. So this is his view of human nature, and it's quite different to what we've known already, connecting this to the social context. So let's look at the political implications of Marx's view of human nature. So Marx highlights the centrality of the economic sphere. Because economic activity is central to human beings, Marx believes that the economic sphere is the key to understanding all societies, and the way we produce goods and conduct our economic relations shapes the wider social and political structures of a society. So the economic arrangements of society, including the way in which we distribute all goods, are called mode of production. The social and political organization of society is called superstructure. Every mode of production is accompanied by a particular type of relations of production, which is the relationship between the various people involved in the economic process. And the relations of production, according to Marx, can be understood as social relations which determine the political system and other features of social organization. According to Marx, this model is an accurate account of all human societies throughout history. So for Marx, all human societies are characterized by a sharp and fundamental distinction between those who own the means of production, called the bourgeoisie, and those who are excluded from the ownership of the means of production, the proletariat. And this sharp distinction between bourgeoisie and proletariat you can find everywhere in Marx's thinking. And there's a particular vocabulary used for that. It's called the dialectic. So always having these two opposing poles is called the vocabulary of dialectic in Marx's thinking. So Marx refers to the group of people who control the means of production as the ruling class. And the interests of these two classes are always fundamentally opposed. While the owners of the means of production wish to perpetuate their privileged position, those who are excluded from the ownership of the means of production want to improve their economic position. So all societies are actually characterized by a conflict between these two classes, and this class conflict is something that might be familiar already about Marx for you. Another important point relates to the political and social sphere. For Marx, whoever owns the means of production also dominates the relations of production. Given that the relations of production determine the wider social relations, whoever controls the means of production also controls the political and social system. And this is why he says the economy is central, right? Because if the economy is central and is actually dominating everything else, the social, the political sphere, the means of production are also central and also control the political and social system. So the ruling class not only dominates the economic sphere, it also controls the political and social sphere. And the ruling class maintains and perpetuates this dominance of the social and political sphere in two ways. The first is through its control of the state. So the ruling class sets up a legal and political system which supports its own dominance. It uses the state apparatus to pass laws which protect its own interests. For example, under capitalism, laws protecting private property. So first control through its control of the state, and the second way of dominating the social and political sphere is through its control of thought processes and ideas. So the ruling class also dominates society at the level of thought, at the level of thinking. Through its control of intellectual process and ideas, the ruling class makes its position appear natural and inevitable. So, for example, you've probably already heard of this. Marx always sees religion as a means of social control. For Marx, religion is the opiate of the people, so it prevents people from becoming active or thinking for themselves. So contemporary Marxists always emphasize the role of the mass media as operating with thought control, as controlling our thoughts. So in this way, you can, for example, apply Marxist thinking even today. A new point, or a next point in Marxist thinking, which is quite relevant, is technical innovation and historical change. So for Marx, the root cause of all historical change is to be found in economic and technical innovation. So technical and economic innovation brings about changes in the mode of production, which is so central. This leads to changes in the relations of production, which eventually leads to changes in the overall socio-political superstructure. Take, for example, the transition from feudalism to capitalism. The innovation of modern machinery led to the development of the capitalist mode of production. And this new mode of production produced a new class, the bourgeoisie. So the interests of this new class, the bourgeoisie, were diametrically opposed to the interests of the old ruling class. And while the feudal mode of production requires a workforce that is tied to the land, capitalism relies upon a flexible workforce that can be hired and fired as the capitalist requires. And as the bourgeoisie gain economic strength, they increasingly also begin to wrest political control from the old aristocracy. So in this way you can see the changes. There have been changes to the economy which led to changes in the political system. So from feudalism bound to, working with land to a capitalist system which is working with workforce. Thus, the rise of capitalism is accompanied by important political changes, such as an extension of the franchise to new propertied class, the bourgeoisie. And as the example of the transition from feudalism to capitalism highlights, a change in the mode of production ultimately results in changes in the social and political system. So let's take our short interactive break, because I want to keep you thinking about the dominance of economic activity. And I want you today to just take a piece of paper and write down whether you agree with Marx's idea that economic activity dominates or determines all other spheres of social life, including political life. Do you agree with this idea, or do you not agree with this idea? Just take 1 minute to write down your thoughts. Do you agree with Marx's idea that economic activity dominates social and political life, or do you not agree with it? Just 1 minute. Okay, who agrees with it? Just show your finger. Who agrees with it? Just show your finger up. Who agrees? Okay, who doesn't agree? Okay, what about the others? Not sure? Okay, I want to hear someone who agrees. Why do you agree? What did you think? Because money controls everything. Mm-hmm.
Money control the laws, negative media, politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Those that control laws control mass media, which control us.
Mm-hmm.
What's happening in the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. So those who have money, for example, sometimes dominate the mass media, which controls lots of, political decision making in the end. Yeah, very good. Thank you. And now I want to hear someone who doesn't agree. Yeah.
Well, sometimes economic activity, it does have the ability to influence. The more money you have, the more power it does. But it doesn't give you the complete determines everything. I mean, some things are driven by biology, not really by economics. Even you look at something the media, for instance, there's always alternatives you can look into the investigate that are not influenced by big money.
Okay.
Like politicians, who have themselves to counter it.
Okay, so politicians don't always have to have money, for example, to make certain decisions. Yeah. Mm-hmm. In this way. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Okay. Anything else? Anyone else who doesn't agree with it? Okay. Can you think of an example where you would say, well, this is obvious that this is still relevant today, and the economic sphere is still dominating the political and the social sphere. Can you think of any example? Let's say from everyday politics.
The larger companies or people that have money
So that means opportunity to get invited to all large dinners and things.
Yeah.
So we can actually talk about what we need to sponsor them for the company as a result of our funding responses and competition.
Very good. Just think about the US election campaigns, right? And how, for example, certain, really big multinational companies are actually sponsoring some of the campaigns. And in this way also have, close relations to the candidate and might have some influence on the political agenda as well. And in general, I told you I come from international relations. Multinational companies do have a lot of power today in international politics as well. You regard them as actors in international politics. It's not only states who make the decisions. Multinational companies have lots of power in decision making in international politics today and in national politics as well. Very good. Okay, I just wanted to, get you thinking a little bit about this, and I would say, you could definitely find arguments for saying that Marx is, maybe outdated. For example, the class clash that he's describing with his dialectic vocabulary might not always be the case today anymore, because we don't always have this dialectic between those who own the means of production and those who are working. We also have very different jobs today, right? We don't all work in a factory. We also have work like, let's say, as academics or as experts or as politicians or as consultants or in the service sector, which is a bit different. So there's not always a class clash, I would say, but sometimes you can still find it. You can still find the inequalities that he describes. But from my perspective, something that is very true today is the dominance of the economic sphere, and that the economic sphere is still dominating the political and social sphere. And a good example is that of multinational companies and their power. But I really want to, and this is why we always do these little exercises here to not only make you listen to the ideologies and this thinking, but to really think yourself about certain examples and how you can actually apply them. Okay, let's talk a little bit about capitalism, because that is very dominant in Marx's thinking, and he is basically very heavily criticizing capitalism. Marx mainly makes two claims about capitalism. First, that capitalism is inherently exploitative, and second, that capitalism is inherently unstable. So let's talk about exploitation. Capitalism is characterized by a fundamental distinction between the bourgeoisie, those who own the means of production or the capital, and the proletariat, who need to sell their labor in order to survive. In one way, these groups are mutually dependent upon one another. So the proletariat needs the bourgeoisie in order to gain employment, and the bourgeoisie needs the labor power of the proletariat in order to produce things. However, despite their mutual dependence, these two groups are constantly in conflict with one another. While the proletariat want to earn as much as possible in exchange for their labor, the bourgeoisie capitalist wants to pay the worker as little as possible as to maximize his or her profits. So now, according to Marx, the only way in which the capitalist can make a profit is if he exploits the laborer. So according to Marx, machinery or capital on its own cannot produce a profit. The only thing that can add value to a product is labor. So the only way in which the capitalist can make a profit if he pays the worker less than his or her work is worth. So the goods which have been produced by a particular laborer have a certain exchange value. That is the price of a particular good. This is the price which a particular good will fetch when it's sold in the marketplace. That's the exchange value. According to Marx, The market price of a particular good reflects the amount of labor that has gone into it. So the more labor time it takes to produce something, the more expensive it will be. So let me give you an example. Let's say in the course of an 8-hour working day, a worker produces a good which is worth £80. However, the worker only earns £50 a day, per day. Now, it only takes the worker 5 hours to produce goods with an exchange value of £50. Therefore, in an 8-hour working day, the worker is effectively working 3 hours without pay, producing goods with an additional exchange value of £30. So he works 8 hours, produces something which is worth £80, but he's only getting paid £50, which means 3 hours he worked in addition for an additional exchange value. Marx calls this difference between what the worker is paid, the £50, and the value of the good he produces, the £80, the surplus value. The difference is this £30 is the surplus value. This surplus value is expropriated by the capitalist. The capitalist takes these £30. So once we reduce, let's say, rent, dividends, and other costs from the surplus value, we are left with a capitalist profit. So Marx assumes that the capitalist will reinvest these profits, let's say by buying more machinery, thereby increasing the ability to hire even more labor, which in turn will result in an even bigger profit. So capitalism is inevitably exploitative. Marx also argues that the capitalist mode of production is inherently unstable. If the capitalists engaged in the production of a particular commodity, let's say washing machines, are making a healthy profit, then this will encourage other capitalists to enter the market and to also start producing washing machines. So sooner or later, we will be in a situation in which there are so many firms producing washing machines that supply outstrips demand. So we have a situation of overproduction here. Now, this glut of washing machines will result in a fall in price of washing machines, of course, as the various capitalists compete with each other to sell their products. However, this fall in prices threatens the profit of the capitalist. So the capitalist responds to this by cutting the wages of the laborer in an attempt to protect his own profits. So Marx assumes that laborers will not be able to resist this move, especially if there is a large pool of unemployed people. However, if all employers start cutting the wages of their laborers, then this will reduce the overall buying power in the marketplace. So people won't have enough money to actually buy the washing machines. So putting further pressure on the manufacturers to cut the prices again, which will lead to further wage cuts and so on. Eventually, enough manufacturers will go out of business to restore the balance between supply and demand. So capitalism, summarized, is characterized by a constant cycle of booms and slumps. Marx assumes that as capitalism develops, this trade cycle will oscillate even more violently. And in this process, the proletariat, the workers, the laborers, will become poorer and poorer. So as we have seen already in capitalist society, the bourgeoisie not only controls the means of production, it also dominates the social and political sphere. Like other ruling classes before, it achieves this domination through A, its control of the state, and B, its control of thought processes and ideas. So as we saw earlier in the course of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, the bourgeoisie gradually gains power of the state apparatus. The bourgeoisie employs the state apparatus in order to secure its own interests. For example, it passes laws to protect private property, thereby securing its grip on the means of production. It also uses the state apparatus to oppress the proletariat and imposes restrictions on union organization and so on. But how can Marx maintain that the state in modern capitalist societies oppresses the proletariat, given that capitalist societies, such as, let's say, Britain, are liberal democracies? How can he maintain that in a liberal democracy? For him, a parliamentary democracy is simply a smokescreen. While the government gives the impression of acting in the interests of the people, it really just protects the interests of the bourgeoisie. So parliamentary democracy is just a way of disguising oppression. The bourgeoisie does not only dominate the state, it also controls intellectual life. So, for example, classical economic theory justifies competition and a minimal state. And, for example, the Christian doctrine of humility and earthly poverty serves to justify social hierarchies. That's how Marx would interpret it. Marx also believes in the proletarian revolution, and this is something you might have also already heard of. He believes that despite the bourgeoisie's control of the means of production and the state apparatus and its domination of intellectual life, the proletariat will actually eventually overthrow capitalism and replace capitalism first with a socialist ideology, and socialist means that the government owns the means of production and not the bourgeoisie anymore. This is the difference between actually Marxist thinking and socialist thinking. So Marx suggests that socialism is only one stage which will be passed, and it's a stage in which not the bourgeoisie owns the means of production but the government. And then later on, his ideal is a communist society, a communist ideology in which the workers actually own the means of production. And that's quite important. So this will happen because of contradictions in capitalism. He sees several contradictions in capitalism. A, capitalism can only thrive by creating extremes of wealth and poverty. There are always, remember dialectic, there are always these extremes, an extreme of wealth and an extreme of poverty. So relations between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat become increasingly polarized. There will be more and more large businesses, and competition will squeeze out many capitalists. Small businessmen and failed capitalists will be absorbed into the proletariat because he says capitalism is basically unstable. It will collapse at a certain point, and maybe, certain businessmen will be absorbed into the proletariat. And as the proletariat becomes more impoverished, they become increasingly aware of their situation. And let's say academics, for example, will side with the proletariat to heighten their self-awareness. And if certain failed capitalists and academics, which he calls intelligentsia, will side with the proletariat, which is impoverished, the proletariat will actually be able to overthrow the capitalists, and this will lead to a common ownership of the means of production, and this is his revolution that he envisions. Marx actually did not predict the precise nature and timing of the proletarian revolution. All he tells us about is what conditions have to be met for a successful revolution to take place. So a proletarian revolution does not necessarily have to be violent. In part 2 of the Communist Manifesto, for example, Marx emphasizes the gradual nature of the proletarian revolution. So not all capitalists are to be instantly expropriated. Instead, there is to be gradual progression towards collective ownership. So this is his ideal that he envisions, collective ownership of the means of productions. All workers actually own the means of production in the end, but he sees a gradual progression, and he does not think that this necessarily has to be violent. So it would be a misinterpretation to describe Marx as a simple determinist. Once the conditions for a revolution had been met, it would not come about automatically. And the outline objective conditions have to be met, but it still depends on the deliberative action of the people whether this revolution will come into place. So many neo-Marxists that still work with Marxist thinking actually always argue that he wasn't wrong about the revolution, but the conditions haven't been met yet, and the people, didn't become active enough yet to actually start a revolution. So this is the introduction into Marxist thinking, and I promised you, I brought you some pieces of his main works, and this is Karl Marx from the Communist Manifesto, and I'm going to read this out to you. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motely feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, callous cash payment. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless, indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single, unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions, it has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Just for you to see some of the actual words that he's using. What do you see reflected in this quote that we have learned today or discussed today? Is there anything you recognize?
The idea of exploitation of the free trade that was supposedly there, and just the truth of that.
Yeah. So free trade, capitalism, is basically exploitation, very important. And you see how he describes this, right? Naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. So you can see his criticism in here. Is there anything else that you recognize?
Personal worth into exchange value.
Aha.
Is to do with like the alienation of the proletariat to their produce.
Yeah. Very important. He talks about the alienation of labor. So he sees labor as important as a creative activity of human beings, but it's and he says alienated, so it's taken away from, as it's not a personal value anymore, it's taken away from your personality and given to someone else for, making surplus values. And this you can find in this quote. It has resolved personal wealth into exchange value. That's quite important. Anything else that you recognize? Yep.
Religious and political illusions masking exploitation.
Yeah, very good. So religion, he's very much criticizing religion because it's taking away, he says opiate of the people, right? So it's making people passive and, thinking about maybe a future world where they're, let's say, born again or where they're with God. But it doesn't make them, active people, active protesters that would, let's say, start a revolution, So it's just an illusion. And the political sphere is also an illusion because it's just pretending, and behind that, the really important core is economic relations and this, dialectic of those who own the means of production and those who don't. So religious exploitation is veiled by religious and political illusions. Very important. Very good. Let's look at the capital. I'll just read out this quote again. Within the capitalist system, all methods for raising the social productiveness of labor are brought about at the cost of the individual laborer. All means for the development of production transform themselves into means of domination over and exploitation of the producers. They mutilate the laborer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy every remnant of charm in his work, and turn it into a hated toil. They estrange from him the intellectual potentialities of the labor process. Anything sounds familiar? Anything you recognize from what we said about his basic ideas? Yes, again, exploitation of the producers. Yep, it's very much focusing on exploitation. Anything else maybe about his view of human nature? Or anything else? Let's see one more, and then I'll let you go.
To get down to the level of an appendage of a machine,
Uh-huh.
just what they thought for himself, it just operates mindlessly, and just does what it's told to do. So it doesn't think about what he's doing, or think that this is right.
Yeah. And it's taking away the creativity. Again, we have this alienation mentioned here, and it's taking away the creativity, and this relates very much to his understanding of human nature, which is embedded in a social context, and which actually suggests that we become very competitive laborers in a system, in a capitalist system like that, whereas we would be more cooperative if we would live in a different, let's say, communist system in which all the workers own the means of production. Okay, thank you very much for coming and listening and participating. And on next week we will talk about socialism and differentiate a little bit between Marxist and socialist thinking. Thanks for coming.